The war was over. The Emperor's voice, thin, trembling, and speaking in a formal dialect few Japanese had ever heard, had crackled across radios across the archipelago that morning. Japan was surrendering, unconditionally. The killing was finished. Except that it wasn't. At precisely the moment those words reached the airwaves, a Japanese naval lieutenant strapped into the cockpit of his Zero fighter, pushed the throttle forward, and climbed into the sky above Tokyo. He had no left hand. A B-29 gunner had blown it off 7 months earlier, and yet here he was, prosthetic in place, formation behind him, searching for American aircraft to destroy. He found them. What happened next in the skies above a Japanese airfield called Atsugi is one of the most haunting episodes in the entire history of air combat. It was the last major dogfight of the Second World War. 4 young American pilots, men who had taken off in wartime, died in the first minutes of peace, and the Japanese pilot who shot them down became an ace on the day the war ended. This is the story of Lieutenant Yutaka Morioka, the 302nd Kokutai, and the final aerial battle of the greatest conflict in human history. If you want more stories like this, documented, detailed, and told the way they deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button. Right now, we cover the full history, the weapons, the men, the decisions that decided battles. And we never cut corners on the facts. In the spring of 1944, while the war in the Pacific was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, the Imperial Japanese Navy created a new air group at Atsugi Airfield, roughly 20 miles southwest of Tokyo. Its designation was the 302nd Kokutai, and its mission was simple and dire: defend the capital against the American B-29 superfortresses that everyone knew were coming. Japan had seen what B-29s did to cities. Firebombing runs over Tokyo in the spring of 1945 would eventually kill more civilians in a single night than either atomic bomb. The 302nd was supposed to stop that. They were equipped with late Model Zeros and with the Mitsubishi J2M3 Raiden, what American pilots called the Jack, a big, heavy, hard-fighting interceptor armed with 4 20mm cannons. These were serious machines, and the 302nd was stocked with serious pilots. Among them was a young lieutenant named Yutaka Morioka. Morioka was 23 years old, making him one of the youngest air group commanders in the Imperial Japanese Navy's history. He had trained originally as a dive bomber pilot in 1942, missing the great carrier battles that had consumed and destroyed the cream of Japanese naval aviation at Midway. And in the Solomons, that absence was both a loss and a gift. Where so many of Japan's finest pilots had died over the Pacific in 1942 and 1943, Morioka had survived. He transitioned to fighters in the spring of 1944, bringing with him the discipline and precision that dive bomber training demanded. A different kind of combat eye, one trained to judge angles and speed and timing in cold calculation. By the winter of 1945, Morioka had 4 confirmed aerial victories. He was well on his way to becoming an ace, the universal threshold, 5 kills, respected by every air force in the war. Then on January 23, 1945, everything changed. Morioka was attacking a B-29 of the 73rd Bomb Wing during an intercept mission over the home islands. He made his firing pass, closing to close range in the way Japanese interceptor doctrine demanded, and a tail gunner aboard the American bomber found his mark. The burst hit Morioka's cockpit. His left hand was gone, blown away at the wrist in an instant of shattering violence. What happened next defied reasonable explanation. Morioka, bleeding heavily, in shock, with an aircraft still under his control only by virtue of his remaining hand and whatever iron-hard will his training had produced, managed to bring his Zero down to a landing. His mechanics found him in the cockpit, alive, barely. It was considered something close to a miracle. He did not quit. By August 1945, Morioka was back in the air with a prosthetic device fitted where his left hand had been. The 302nd was still flying. The B-29 raids had continued. Tokyo had burned. Hiroshima had been destroyed on August 6, Nagasaki on August 9th, the Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan on August 8th. The logic of Japan's position had collapsed entirely, and anyone who could read a map understood it. But at Atsugi, the 302nd Kokutai had not stopped flying. Aboard the USS Yorktown, operating with Task Force 38 off the coast of Japan's main island of Honshu, the men of Fighter Squadron 88, Bef 88, the Gamecocks, had been living in the exhausting suspension of combat aviation for weeks. Air Group 88 was one of the newest in the fleet. They had come aboard Yorktown in June 1945, fresh, eager, and dense with what the Navy called nuggets, rookie aviators on their first combat deployment. The Pacific War was nearly over and everyone knew it, which made every mission feel simultaneously routine and unbearably dangerous. You didn't want to be the last man to die in a war that was already won. Lieutenant Howard Howdy Harrison was the opposite of a nugget, a veteran pilot beloved by every man in his squadron. He was the kind of officer that the Navy called a natural leader, and that his fellow aviators called simply the friendliest, straightest man they'd ever met. Harrison led with warmth, not authority. His men flew harder for him because they didn't want to let him down. Alongside Harrison flew 3 other pilots on the morning of August 15th, Lieutenant Joseph Saloff and Ensigns Wright Billy Hobbs and Eugene Manderberg. Hobbs and Manderberg were nuggets. This would be one of their last missions, or so everyone assumed. The story of why Harrison's flight was even airborne that morning has its own quiet tragedy embedded in it. His crew had not been scheduled to fly on August 15th, but Harrison knew that Hobbs was one mission short of the requirement for a promotion to Lieutenant Junior grade. Harrison voluntarily switched his team's schedule to ensure the young ensign would get his promotion. It was the kind of thing Howdy Harrison did. He looked after his people. At 4:15 that morning, the carriers of Task Force 38 launched their aircraft into the pre-dawn darkness. Strikes against Tokyo area targets, airfields, industrial facilities, infrastructure were the objective. 2 hours later, with the first wave already approaching Japan, an urgent message reached Admiral Nimitz. Japan had accepted the Allied surrender terms. The war was over. Nimitz immediately ordered a flash message sent to all fleet units. Cease all offensive operations. Pilots already airborne were to jettison their ordnance over the water and return to their ships. The war was done. The message reached Harrison and his flight as they were circling over Atsugi Airfield, preparing for their attack run. Harrison acknowledged, led the flight. In a final circle over the target, had his pilots dump their rockets into the empty sky and turned for the sea. 5 miles. That was all the distance separating them from the rest of their lives. They never covered it. Tally-ho! Many rats, 6 o'clock high, diving! The voice in the radio was Saloff's, sharp, urgent, the trained call of a pilot who has spotted danger and knows he has seconds to act. They came from above and behind, out of the overcast, an estimated 15 to 20 Japanese fighters, some army types, some navy, sliding down in a near-perfect 6 o'clock attack. The geometry of it was precise. They had the altitude, they had the angle, and the American pilots, loaded with the news that the war had just ended, their minds already turning toward home, toward survival, toward the impossible idea that they were going to make it, were caught flat. From that moment, as the action report of the engagement later described it in plain, devastating language, from then on, it was a melee, with everyone fighting in the same air. Leading the attacking force from Atsugi was Morioka, with 8 zeros. Alongside them flew 4 Jacks, the J2M3 Raidens, those heavy interceptors with their 4 20mm cannons. In aggregate, it was perhaps the most lethal concentration of Japanese fighter capability deployed over the Tokyo plain in months. What the Americans did not know, and would not learn until after the war, was that Morioka had received the same ceasefire order as Harrison. The Emperor's broadcast had reached Atsugi. His superior officers at the 302nd had transmitted orders to stand down, to return, to comply with The surrender. Morioka heard those orders. He ignored them. He pressed the attack. The fight that followed was violent, brief, and conclusive. In the swirling chaos over the Tokyo plain, 4 American Hellcats went down. Harrison, Hobbs, Manderberg, and Sarloff, the veteran and the 3 young men he had volunteered to fly alongside, were lost. Harrison was last seen, fighting at low altitude, his aircraft and at least 1 Japanese fighter going down in close proximity. Hobbs, whose birthday it was, he turned 23 that morning, never came home. Manderberg didn't make it either. Sarloff, wounded, managed to control his aircraft long enough for his wingman Maurice Proctor to see it spiral into the sea. 2 pilots, Proctor and a pilot named Hansen, made it back to the Yorktown. Hansen returned alone, certain he was the only survivor, heartbroken. His spirits rose briefly when Proctor trapped aboard the carrier a few minutes later. In the debrief, the 2 survivors claimed a combined 5 kills. The intelligence officer subsequently awarded 1 kill each to the 4 pilots who had died, a posthumous accounting, precise and inadequate. Meanwhile, Japanese records from that day are incomplete and, in some places, contradictory. The 302nd Kokutai's own logs show losses 1, 0, and 2, Jack's 3 aircraft gone, but in the chaos of the day, with multiple Japanese units operating in the same airspace and all unit records subject to the disruptions of an empire in the act of surrendering, definitive accounting is impossible. What is documented is this. Lieutenant Yutaka Morioka officially claimed 1 confirmed kill over F-6F Hellcats near Atsugi on August 15, 1945. That kill was his 5th. On the last day of air combat in the Second World War, Yutaka Morioka became a fighter ace. The world that Morioka returned to after landing at Atsugi was not the world he had taken off into. At noon on August 15th, while the men of Task Force 38 were learning to believe they had survived, Emperor Hirohito's voice went out across Japan for the first time, in the formal, archaic court dialect that few ordinary Japanese could fully parse. The Emperor announced the surrender. He spoke of an unbearable situation. He told his people to endure the unendurable. Most of them wept. Some of them didn't believe it at first. Some of the military officers who surrounded the Emperor had, the night before, attempted a palace coup to prevent the broadcast from ever happening. They failed. The surrender went out and Japan began the slow, devastating process of accepting what had come to it. At Atsugi, the reaction was different. The 302nd Kokutai and the broader Atsugi garrison did not immediately comply. For days following the surrender, the base remained in a state of defiance. Officers and pilots refusing to disarm, refusing to accept the reality that their war was over. Commander Yasuna Kozuno, the 302nd's commanding officer, reportedly suffered a mental breakdown. In the days following the surrender, the strain of the moment manifesting itself in something close to breakdown. The garrison eventually surrendered without bloodshed, but the decompression of those days was long and difficult. The full weight of what had happened on August 15th, the magnitude of who those 4 American pilots were, what they had carried with them, what had been taken from them in the first minutes of peace, would take years to settle into historical consciousness. Billy Hobbs had written in his diary a few weeks before about his first real combat hop. I was certainly scared, he wrote, saw plenty of anti-aircraft fire, saw first Jap plane in the air, the diary of a young man trying to be brave, trying to make sense of what he had volunteered for. He was 23 years old. On the day he died, it was his birthday. The night before the final mission, another pilot in the squadron, Maurice Proctor, wrote in his own diary, "If ever I prayed in my life, I am praying tonight that they will end this bloody war. Tonight," he added, after learning the strikes would continue. Chaplain Moody just came by and said, "No dice on the news, so I guess we will strike." He was one of the 2 who came home. There is a question that history cannot fully answer, and it concerns the mind of Yutaka Morioka on the morning of August 15, 1945. He had received the ceasefire order. There is no credible account suggesting he was unaware of the surrender. He was not like some Japanese Soldiers who would spend years in remote jungles fighting a war they didn't know had ended. Morioka knew. His commanding officer had transmitted the order. The Emperor's broadcast was going out. He chose anyway to attack. Why? The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty because Morioka did not leave a detailed account of his reasoning that has survived in the historical record. But the context suggests several possibilities that any honest reckoning with his decision must hold together at once. There was the warrior code, Bushido, however imperfectly practiced, and its demand that a fighter pilot not leave an enemy aircraft unmolested above his country's soil while he turned away. There was the particular outrage of those American Hellcats circling Atsugi airfield at the very moment of national humiliation. There was the fact that Morioka's war had been a war of constant sacrifice, a hand lost, months of recovery, a return to combat flying a fighter with a prosthetic device, and that everything he had poured into that war was, in the span of a morning radio broadcast, being declared void. And there was something else, harder to name. Japan's military culture in 1945 was saturated with the idea that certain things could not be surrendered. Pilots at Atsugi had been training and preparing for a last-ditch defense of the home islands. The logic of their entire existence had been organized around resistance to the very fleet whose aircraft were now circling overhead, preparing to go home. For some of these men, the idea of simply stopping was not psychologically accessible. None of this excuses what happened. 4 men died who had been told the war was over. They were following orders to return to their ship when they were attacked. Harrison, Hobbs, Manderberg, and Saloff had survived the war. They were killed in the peace. But history does not ask us only to condemn. It asks us also to understand. And the understanding of what happened at Atsugi on August 15, 1945, requires us to sit with the full complexity of a man who was by any measure a remarkable pilot and a deeply damaged warrior operating at the outer limits of human endurance in the final moments of a catastrophic national defeat. The question of who fought the last air battle of the Second World War is contested, as such questions always are at the margins of history. Royal Navy Seafires and Japanese Zeros tangled over Tokyo Bay on the same morning in a separate engagement. Japanese fighters attacked Allied aircraft in isolated incidents for days afterward. The formal surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri didn't take place until September 2, 1945. But the fight over Atsugi, the loss of Harrison, Hobbs, Manderberg, and Saloff, is widely recognized by historians as the last substantial air battle of the Pacific War, and by any accounting it is the most documented, the most human, and the most tragic. For decades, these 4 men's names were nearly unknown outside the families who mourned them and the few historians who studied the war's final hours. No monument was raised to them in the immediate post-war period. The books and articles that covered the Pacific War's end focused on the grand sweep of surrender, the Missouri, the MacArthur arrival at Atsugi, the very airfield where Morioka had taken off, now serving as the formal entry point for the American occupation of Japan. It was not until historian John Wukovits published Dogfight over Tokyo that Harrison, Hobbs, Manderberg, and Saloff received the full accounting they deserved. A detailed, sourced human narrative of who these men were, where they came from, and how they died. They were the last. That should mean something. It does mean something. There is one more detail that deserves to be said aloud before this story closes. Morioka's 5th kill, the one that made him an ace, was almost certainly not one of the 4 Hellcats that went down from Harrison's flight. Japanese records, to the extent they can be cross-referenced with American accounts, suggest the 302nd Kokutai engaged at least 2 separate groups of American aircraft that morning. Morioka's confirmed single claim most likely corresponds with the VF-88 engagement near Atsugi, but the exact pilot and the exact aircraft remain uncertain. War's bookkeeping is always imprecise, and August 15, 1945, over the Tokyo plain was more chaotic than most. What is not imprecise is this. 4 American pilots died. 1 Japanese pilot became an ace. And the war ended a few minutes later, in the same sky where all of it happened. You may find yourself asking, as I did, researching this story. What happened to Yutaka Morioka after the war? The records are fragmentary. He survived. He returned to civilian life, as did most Japanese veterans of a military that ceased to exist in September 1945. The record does not preserve for us whether he spoke about the morning of August 15th, 1945, whether he considered what his decision had cost, whether the names Harrison or Hobbs or Manderberg or Saloff ever reached him in the years that followed. There is a photograph that has survived of Morioka's Zero aircraft, Yo-D-106, a Nakajima-built A6M7, the forward part of the spinner painted red, a fighter pilot's personal marking, a small declaration of identity within the enormous machinery of industrial war. It is a beautiful machine photographed at Atsugi, still and grounded sometime in 1945. The man who flew it made a decision on August 15th that history has not yet fully processed. For Billy Hobbs, there are no more photographs. Only the diary ending, the way diaries do when the writer doesn't come home. This was my first real combat hop, and I was certainly scared. Saw plenty of anti-aircraft fire, saw first Jap plane in the air. He saw his last one over Atsugi, on his birthday on the first day of peace. We owe it to these men to remember them by name. Howard, Howdy Harrison, Wright Billy Hobbs, Eugene Manderberg, Joseph Saloff. They were the last Americans to die in combat in the Second World War. They were killed by a one-handed Japanese ace on the morning that the killing was supposed to stop. That is a story that deserves to be told and retold and not forgotten. If this channel means something to you, if you believe that, history done right, with rigor and respect for the men who lived, it matters, then subscribe. Hit the bell, share this video with someone who ought to know this story. We'll be here, telling the ones that aren't told often enough.